Hello, everyone. Brad Hairston here. Welcome to Transform Now. My guest today is Dr. Lou Bachenheimer, CTO of the Americas at SS&C Blue Prism. Lou has been on the podcast several times before, and today we'll be discussing task-based agents and where they fit into this whole agentic automation arena. Lou, welcome back. Why don't you tell everyone a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks, Brad. Good to be back. Like Brad said, I'm Dr. Lou Bachenheimer. I'm CTO of the Americas for SS&C Blue Prism. I've been with Blue Prism for over 7 years now, worn many different hats, but it's been a really interesting time to be in this role as we see the convergence of different automation technologies and generative AI and agentic and all coming together to really transform how work and automation is done. So yeah, exciting time to be in automation.
Things are moving pretty quickly, my friend. I think you would agree.
Yep.
In fact, I saw the 2025 Gartner hype curve, and AI agents are right at the top. So they're almost over the hype curve. I mean, that's how quickly things are moving. And we know many companies have begun to invest in agentic automation, while others are still waiting and watching. And for the thousands of companies who are heavily using robotic process automation, one obvious question is, where does RPA fit into all of this? So, Lou, perhaps we could start this dialogue by you explaining the maturity curve and what are the different levels of agentic automation so we can get grounded.
I think that's a great place to start, because it really does come down to those different levels, like you're saying. I like to compare it to automatic driving or self-driving cars. Right? When it was first announced that we'd have self-driving cars, Elon Musk was talking about them for the Teslas. Everyone instantly assumed these cars wouldn't have a steering wheel and just take you anywhere you wanted to go. And here we are many years later, and that still isn't the case. What we had to do is break it down into the different autonomous driving levels, where you have AD1 being adaptive cruise control, all the way up to 85, where we're taking that steering wheel out. I think we can use a similar type of approach to agentic, because when people first started all the hype around agentic, it was these agents are just going to go in and automatically know how to do everything, do it all for you. They'd build automations on the fly, execute and delete them. And while maybe one day we'll get there, we're not there yet. And the technology for that just doesn't exist in a way to do it at the governed level. So there are many different definitions of the different levels of agentic. The one I like the best was actually put out by Everest, and it has 4 different levels, where the first level are your task-based agents. So these are where you have an agent that does one specific task. And even Everest calls out that agent is almost a misnomer here. I like to point out that if you change the name from model to agent, it doesn't automatically double your cost savings, but it does double the attention you get for that piece, because like you said, the hype curve is right up there. When we get to level 2, that's when we start seeing the orchestration of the different task agents. And that's where this all starts being useful. Because if you have one specific task, that's generally not going to be enough to accomplish real work. Right? Almost no one has a job where they do one specific thing all day, every day. That's not how work works. That we can do today. We can do that with different orchestration capabilities or agentic flow builders. But as Everest points out, we haven't gotten to the 3rd level. And each of these levels is now just about increasing the amount of agency or autonomy that we have, or that we can effectively govern at the enterprise scale. So when we move into level 3, that's when we still have dedicated task agents that are executing in pre-approved governed manners. But the orchestration of those is much more fluid. We can have the agents be able to understand business priorities and restructure that workflow and what order those steps are done. Maybe can steps be skipped so that we can be far more efficient. And eventually we'll get to level 4 where we add that autonomy to the task agents as well. At that point, we can really get to the point where we don't need predefined governed flows because we have the governance built in even on the fly. But most experts agree level 3 is probably a year out. I know internally we're working pretty heavily on that. Level 4, probably at least 3 years. Because when we're talking about that level of governance and reliability, that's just not where Gen AI is. So I don't know what technology we'll need to accomplish that, but it's going to be something new, which is exciting.
Yeah. Well, those 4 levels, I mean, just knowing those and as you described kind of how you progress from one to the other, that's really helpful to understand, where we are today and where things are going. And I know a lot of companies are probably sighing, there's a big sigh of relief because they're thinking they're so far behind, and yet most companies haven't gotten to level 3, quite yet.
Yeah, because it doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So let's go back to the first level. You talked about task-based agents. Perhaps you could just break it down and explain how are those different than RPA automations that companies use today?
It's a great question. And it really differs in 2 ways. The first is lots of tasks don't require any form of a user interface, right? Like if I am doing something that only requires API calls or machine level integration, there's no need to be involving RPA at that point. We can do this, serverless, spin up the computing power we need on demand. It'll be drastically cheaper and generally a lot more secure. That said, there are some capabilities where you do need to interact with the user interface, and that's where RPA style task agents come in. Now, this brings us to the second big difference between pure play RPA and RPA task agents, which is really comes down to scope. If we think about a task agent, it's going to do one specific thing. But if we look at how RPA is deployed, especially at companies who've scaled it out, there are many different tasks in each RPA process. So really what we've started doing internally at SS&C, and what I'd advise other folks who have RPA deployed to do, is to start separating out the individual tasks within an RPA process into those more reusable, smaller chunks that we would call a task agent, and move that orchestration capability. After I do this task, what's the next task? Move that up into that orchestration layer. And that starts you bringing into the level 2 agentic, which is really what most of us think of as agentic today, where we're looking at an end-to-end business process where we have an agent that can handle it and do each task needed along the way.
Interesting. So Lou, just to clarify, are all task-based agents RPA-based then?
Absolutely not. A good example, internally, we process a lot of documents. One of our businesses is a mailroom outsourcing business. We handle an absolutely obscene number of documents on a daily basis. So document processing is a major concern. So one of the first agents we built out internally was a document processing agent. Now, that's not leveraging any form of a user interface, just going through different API level interactions. And while we did have to build a lot around the governance side and the back end, no part of that document processing agent requires any RPA at all.
And this brings up a bunch of other questions when you think about becoming taking an RPA automation, turning it into a task-based agent. How do the agents handle things like exceptions and decision making and contextual changes, how do they handle those things better than a traditional RPA workflow?
It's another great question, because a traditional RPA workflow is somewhat limited. You can do effectively anything, because RPA can do anything a person can do sitting at a computer. And from a work environment, that's almost everything. Where RPA starts to struggle is when you're orchestrating work beyond just what one person would do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the agentic capabilities really start to shine, because you can now have that orchestration calling on RPA task agents, calling on API-based task agents, or even allocating work to human employees as needed. That's a piece we do internally a lot as well. We check confidence levels for anything coming back from an AI.
Right.
And if the confidence levels are lower than where we need them to be, we will run them through different verification steps, including potentially human verification. The other piece, though, is when we think about general exception handling, something went wrong, that you often want to have, if you're doing pure play RPA, that will exist in the RPA piece itself. And typically, best practice is to have some form of multi-layered exception handling in RPA, where your top layer is basically, did I already do everything else? Yep, I checked it. I'll mark it as an exception, move on. Great for not crashing. But then you have the lower levels where, oh, I tried to do this. The web page didn't load. What do I do now? Oftentimes that's, close it, launch the browser again. The good old fashioned power cycle works 9 times out of 10.
Mm-hmm.
But that's all orchestration when we really think of it.
Yeah.
What we can do is strip that out and put it into that higher level. So the task agent just does this task. And if anything goes wrong there, rather than trying to account for everything there, we can handle that on the orchestration layer, because we don't necessarily know that the same thing's going to go wrong each time. And it's hard to account for everything. But this way we can move it up a layer so that maybe we're allocating that somewhere else. Maybe we're getting consensus from another piece of software, or maybe eventually when we get to level 3, this is where things start getting really exciting. The orchestration agent can understand something gets wrong and reprioritize tasks or be more dynamic about that workflow to accommodate.
Got it. So Lou, let's talk about how a company would go about turning an RPA automation into a task-based agent. What does that process look like, and how does this change the way that we think about automation?
So yeah, this is near and dear to anyone who's scaled out RPA's heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have these tools and capabilities built out, and we don't want to lose all the work we've done. So what I would advise is to first look at the best practices you've already deployed in an RPA environment. Typically, RPA has 3 layers. We have the application layer, where we're interacting with the specific application. So if I'm going into SAP, doing logging in, doing this sort of a search, etc., I'll have some form of a reusable object in RPA built out for SAP. That's our first layer. Nice and simple. Build out one object for each application. Then we have a second layer, which is your individual tasks. For example, let me log in and pull this report. One nice simple task. Let me submit a report over here. Another simple task. Typically in RPA, those are built out on, there's different functions, different pages, if you will. Somewhat reusable, but reusable within that overall process. And then you have the third layer, which is that overall process, which says, first you pull this report, then you analyze it, then you submit it over here, then you email it to this person. what we're doing is taking the second layer and separating those out so that each component of that task is its own task agent. So we could have, pull the report, that's a task agent. Submit the report, that's a task agent. Email it to people, that's a task agent. Because now we have more reusable components that we can give to the orchestration agents. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So speak to like what you think are some of the biggest technical or even organizational challenges that companies will face in transitioning from RPA automations to task-based agents.
So this is going to come twofold. First, we have the things everyone is thinking about. Okay, I need to move my orchestration to an orchestration layer. What if I don't have an orchestration layer? That's where you could use like a BPM as an existing tool today, or there are a bunch of different flow building technologies out there, different agentic flow builders to have that agentic level of orchestration. That's where people focus, but frankly, that's kind of the easy part because that's a solved problem. The tricky part is what people aren't thinking about, which is how we're governing this and how we're ensuring that regardless of what type of task agent we're calling on, all of the AI associated with it is staying secure. When I think about the example I described earlier, where we have a document processing agent, documents often contain sensitive data. It's not enough to just run all that data through a generative AI and get an output, because where is that data going? Do we have data leakage? Are we having, is there a potential for malicious prompt injection? Is there toxicity being added? When that AI model is connecting with other systems of record, is there any negative effects coming in from there? It's not enough to just isolate it within a local environment, because these systems are talking to each other.
Yeah.
So the key piece folks have to think about is how you're governing this, how you are mitigating a lot of the concerns that come up from applying agentic AI. Because another misconception people often have is that agentic AI is its own technology. It's not. It's a methodology often based on generative AI. Right? We want to use the AI to understand a business case and be able to execute. But generative AI is fundamentally problematic when it comes to predictability, auditability, bias, and misinformation. So what we want to do is first allow the generative AI or the agents to execute without going off the rails. So that's where the task agents and the predefined governed methodologies come into play. I like to think of task agents as the hands and the AI or the agent as the brain. That's one piece. The other is, while it's thinking, while it's making those decisions, how are we ensuring that there isn't bias? If we have a mortgage approval agent, how are we making sure it isn't being sexist? Because generative AI is based off of natural language and inherits the bias of the natural language. English language has significant gender bias.
Yeah.
That's absolutely inherited into different large language models. You can test this. Sorry, I might be getting a little into the weeds here, but for those who aren't as familiar with generative AI, it's really just the analogies from your SATs on steroids. As dog is to puppy, cat is to kitten. And it works by breaking down the different concepts for words and assigning each concept a dimension. So we have like X, Y, Z. Now we might have like size, color, different concepts being dimensions, which allow you to plot a point for each word. Then you can draw that analogy or a line from one point or one word to another word, and that's a vector. So if I draw a line from puppy to dog, and then I draw that same line, take that same vector and start at kitten, it should take me to cat. If you do the same thing from man to doctor and take that same direction and start at the word woman, it will take you to nurse. Yes, yeah, I see. You're seeing the issue there, right?
Yeah.
There is fundamental bias built into our language. Combine that with the fact that generative AI is effectively a black box. You can't audit how a specific decision was made. Means that if you're having these agents making decisions, you could potentially be opening yourself up to huge litigation. So that's the piece folks really need to focus on, is how are you going to start leveraging these capabilities, leveraging the agency of agentic or agentic agents. And again, I apologize for the huge overuse of the term agent, but how are you going to leverage those capabilities while proving that you're not being biased? And that is where governance comes in. And again, this isn't something that a fundamental roadblock. There are solutions out there to handle that, to audit it, to make sure that you're checking for bias and prove that you aren't using it. But that needs to be a key concern, almost a prerequisite before you can start leveraging these sorts of techniques.
Yeah. There was a recent Anthropic experiment that you may have read about that really connects well with this. They
Is this where Claude ran a war?
Yeah, Claude ran a business, right? And they called the agent Claudius, and they gave it some good direction, and prompt was not one line, it was a paragraph giving it direction on what to do. At the end of the test, Anthropic was pretty honest and open about, in the end, there are things that we can't predict that will happen that can cause issues. And so we're going to have to be upfront about the fact that governance has got to be top of mind. It's got to be well-defined ahead of time, but it's not going to cover everything. There's going to be things that we just cannot predict when we start to give more and more autonomy and leeway to agents. So I thought that was a fascinating experiment that they were very open about.
Yeah, and this is nothing new, right? We can think back to, do you remember Tay, Microsoft's first
Oh, yes.
natural language processing?
Oh, yes.
Learned language based off Twitter and had to be pulled within 24 hours because it was so racist.
Yeah. Experiment gone awry. Yeah, for sure.
Whenever we train AI or use AI, we need to be very particular about it. Again, what Anthropic was talking about there, we can try and better engineer our prompts and the like you said, there's a limit to what you can do there because you're trying to predict what problems will arise before they do.
Yeah.
Means that problems are probably going to arise. A better result or a better solution is to screen any returns that you have coming back from a generative AI to check and make sure, quick sanity check. Does this work? Is this biased? Is there misinformation? Is there a hallucination in there? This is also nothing new. The first major usage of any form of this natural language processing was a long time ago at this point. It was IBM Watson playing Jeopardy. And what lots of people don't know is there was a recording, a pre-recording, like a test case with the Jeopardy producers, where a category was 4-letter words and Watson dropped the F-bomb. And the Jeopardy producers are like, that can't fly. But there's no way to predict what sort of words the AI would say. So instead, IBM implemented what they called a potty mouth filter.
Mm-hmm.
where we're going to see what the AI is saying, and then we're going to check it to make sure it's acceptable for primetime television.
Right.
The same sorts of things has to apply here. So anytime you're leveraging any form of AI, we want to first check what we're sending to it, check that prompt, make sure there's no data leakage, prompt injection, etc., like I was saying earlier, and then also check its response to make sure that it's accurate, unbiased, and suitable for its use case.
So Lou, as companies begin to move even just to level 1, to task-based agents, do you see this requiring new skill sets in the automation team?
Somewhat, for sure, right? Because we're applying new technologies. A lot of the automation teams are already good at API level automations or RPA style automations, and breaking those down into task agents isn't going to be the biggest hurdle.
Yep.
But how you orchestrate those, how the agent knows which tool to use, and how the agent evaluates what those tools do,
right?
That's an entirely new skill set. And I think what we are seeing now, especially when companies are starting to deploy more and more generative AI, and we're starting to see it actually at scale, right? Like internally, we have a ton of generative AI deployed. We've over, I think it's 2,700 task agents at this point, which are 10% of our total human employees.
Right.
Now that we're starting to see it at scale, there's an entire new set of challenges that folks really never got to see before. And this is not, again, new to automation. This is every new technology that comes out. In the beginning, it's not necessarily the safest, right? Like I sometimes will look at pictures of old tech or, how tech was applied in the beginning, and it makes me shudder. You ever see the first seat belts, or like better yet, the first car seats for children, like a metal cage, and that car has a rough stop, that kid's going to be having a rough day, much less an accident. But as we use technology, as we grow our expertise, we can build those safeguards properly, we can master it, and we can start to use it effectively, even though those potential dangers are still there.
Yeah.
My biggest piece of advice would be to find someone who's already done that, so that you don't have to hit the same mistakes. They say a smart man learns from his mistakes, and a wise man learns from the mistakes of others.
Yeah, for sure. Lou, why do you think now's the right time for companies to make this transition and start turning some of their RPA automations into task-based agents? I mean, what business problems are they going to be able to solve more effectively by doing that?
For starters, if you don't start now, you're going to be too late. Automation at scale is crucial to compete in the modern business environment. And one of the biggest benefits of agents, as opposed to large monolithic automations, is the reusability that enhances greater scale. But the other piece is you want the data. If we think about, we're building out these automations and they do specific tasks, we're auditing that, which means we're building out the data. So down the road, when you want to train out more autonomy, how do you think you're going to train that autonomy? How are you going to train AI to be autonomous on the business processes that your business is using if you don't have any data on the business processes your business is using? So if you start deploying these tools today, not only are you getting the low-hanging fruit, you're starting to get value right away, but you're also setting yourself up for level 3 and level 4 agentic, so that as those technologies become realized, you're ready to go. And then if you want to stay in business, you need to be able to compete. That means you need to be able to move fast. Agentic is the reason there's so much hype because of the speed to value you can start to have. It's hard to say, I'm going to give you a solution that's going to process every type of document in the world. That's a whole piece of software. It's an entire industry. But saying, here's an invoice agent. I'm going to plug and play and it's going to process any invoice you have. Much more specific. You can give it to someone. They can implement it right away. Start going. Agency isn't just about changing up processes, changing up workflows. It's about being more generic. And that applies to every level, because the more generic you can be, the faster you can start seeing value and the more broadly you can apply tools. So one example I see a lot, especially on the RPA side, when we're talking task automation, is when an application changes. RPA is fundamentally interacting with a user interface, right? It needs to click in the right spot, type in the right spot, read, etc. But user interfaces change. And oftentimes in the past, a user interface would change and then you were just kind of SOL. You had to go in and rebuild that piece. It might not be a huge effort. You might just fix one little bit, but it still is that effort. What we can do now is add AI to that mix to give it more agency. Right? We have I did a test, as a recorded demo where we have visual recognition embedded into our RPA. And this is, to be clear, this is not future vaporware, like science fiction. This is something that you can buy today. It exists today. Like we're using it today, where we used the Wayback Machine. It's not familiar. It's an internet archiving site. You can put in any date and any URL to look at a login screen for Netflix here from 2010, every year up until the modern day. And a traditional automation breaks before we get to 2012. The UI changes, the website itself, the HTML changes.
Right.
But using AI to look at that screen the way a person would, it doesn't break. It works all the way up until now.
Mm-hmm.
And the real value of any type of automation comes from scale. We want to be able to put things out and not have to have human babysitters. Because if your agent requires a person to be looking over their shoulder, you're not really saving much effort. You're just helping one person be a little bit better. Not the same scale, not even close. But if you want to not have a human babysitter, you need to be resilient. And if you want to be resilient, you need to be able to adapt. And that's where AI comes in, enhancing what we can do today, what the existing technologies can do, to a point where really kind of the sky's the limit.
That's a good way to put it. So Lou, where do you see things going with the evolution of agents? Do you think they will replace RPA entirely, or will both coexist?
So for now, I think it's a marriage made in heaven. RPA, if you look at why folks deployed it in the first place, and especially why they're deploying it now, it's all about making people more efficient or pure cost cutting, like head count reduction, because those are all fundamentally limited. And our processes in modern business are already pretty darn efficient. Where we see a lot more of the potential these days comes from growth. Right? Like in banking, for example, customer onboarding is a huge limitation.
Mm-hmm.
We have a retirement business at SS&C where we can't onboard customers fast enough. By adding onboarding agents to that solution, we're now able to pull in more customers and generate brand new revenue. That's where we can start applying RPA today. And that's also where we're seeing, again, that need for scale, because if growth is all about scale.
Right.
With that in mind, you need something that's going to be at least as compliant and reliable as a human employee. Typically we want something more. Big benefit of a robot is it doesn't make typos, it doesn't make mistakes. Generative AI isn't there yet. It makes a lot of mistakes. I am a huge generative AI user. I don't even use Google's search at all really anymore. I go to different deep research AI models because generally it does a better job.
Mm-hmm.
But when I'm doing that, I see that it gets stuff wrong kind of a lot. And we can all go test this, go play around with ChatGPT, and you'll see it makes mistakes. There's always that little caveat that they put there saying, calling that out. But that means that it's not something you want touching any sensitive data, not something you want executing without some form of supervision. So until AI gets to the point where it's not making mistakes, where it is reliable, there's no call in a business environment to have it be able to execute directly. I do not want it touching any of my actual business systems because that is just too much for risk. RPA, on the other hand, follows a pre-approved process. It's very well governed. It's fully auditable. It has its strengths are all of the weaknesses of AI. Now, the opposite is also true though. RPA can be rigid. It, is going to follow that specific process, can struggle to adapt. Pulling them together, that's where we have the real power. So right now, it really is a marriage made in heaven. Now, eventually, we're gonna get to Agentic level 4. Technology comes, it improves. We'll get there. I'm very confident. But until then, we need something that will work. And again, I don't know what the technology will be that is my full Jarvis, where I can just make a request and it'll go do it. I'm very excited for when it does exist. It'll save everyone a ton of time and really reshape the way work is done. But we're not there yet. So for the next probably at least 3-4 years, I think RPA is still going to be crucial. If I had to, shake my magic 8-ball and take a guess, I think it's not going to be one or the other. It's going to be more of a convergence. Just like I was describing how RPA can now use AI to look at a surface layer of a screen and be able to adapt.
Yeah.
Having more intelligence in RPA is going to kind of merge with having more governed AI agents to the point that they effectively become one and the same. So I think RPA itself will adapt and change to the point where it is much more flexible, much more general. And at that point, it'll be basically indistinguishable. And that'll be really an exciting change to the way work is done altogether. I see eventually it being, if you're doing a repetitive task, sitting there at your computer, you can get a pop-up that says, "Hey, Brad, looks like you're doing repetitive work. Would you like to assign that to your digital agent?" And you can just say yes, and it's taken off your plate, done for you. It's going to be exciting times, and none of us are going to have to do boring, repetitive stuff. And that really is what makes life an adventure.
Yeah. Blue, great stuff. I really appreciate you joining the podcast to talk about this move into task-based agents. I think you're meeting a lot of companies right where they are and giving them some really good things to think about and possibly act on as well. So thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And I wish you the very best.
You too, Brad. Always a pleasure.